Under the blazing sun of the frontier, where honor was measured in courage and survival often demanded sacrifice, there lived a rancher's daughter whose life was marked by struggle. Her family's land was dry, her father's herd dwindled, and her hands carried the scars of endless toil. Yet, it was not hardship alone that carved her story. It was the scorn of those who mocked her for being poor, for wearing dresses faded by the dust, and for daring to dream beyond the fences that imprisoned her family's hope. They laughed at her in silence and in whispers, forgetting that the West has a way of rewriting fates in the blink of an eye. For every cruel glance and mocking word, she stood taller, though her heart carried wounds unseen. To many, she was just another forgotten girl destined for a life of labor and loneliness. But those who underestimated her could not hear the silent roar of destiny gathering beyond the horizon. In the endless expanse of the plains, where the winds carried secrets older than the white man's fences, a force was moving toward her life, one that would silence every voice of ridicule forever. The Comanche were whispered of in fear across every ranch, every saloon, and every church pew. Their warriors were legends, their strength unmatched, their presence enough to strike terror into the hearts of seasoned men. And among them stood a giant, a leader whose shadow loomed as large as the mountains, and whose word was law among his people. His name carried weight, his footsteps carried storms, and when his gaze fell upon the rancher's daughter, it was not with mockery, but with a reverence no one in her town had ever shown. The moment their paths crossed, the world seemed to split. To those who had scorned her, it was unthinkable, even scandalous, that a woman so belittled could be chosen by a warrior whose power eclipsed all others. Yet, in that choice, there was no pity, there was destiny. The Comanche giant saw in her not weakness, but fire, not poverty, but dignity, not shame, but strength. And with a single declaration, he turned the tables of fate. She would be his bride. From that moment, whispers turned into stunned silence, and the scorn that had weighed on her shoulders vanished beneath the power of his vow. But behind that union lay more than love or honor. It carried the promise of upheaval, of conflict, of a tale that would shake the balance of the frontier. For in the Old West, nothing was ever given freely, and what began as scorn would become the spark of a story written in both blood and glory. The days that followed her unexpected union with the Comanche giant sent ripples through the town. Neighbors who once mocked her could barely meet her eyes, for the scorn that once chained her had been broken by the weight of his presence. The giant was no ordinary warrior. His frame towered above the tallest men, his silence commanded more than the sheriff's loudest threats, and his watchful gaze made even the most reckless cowboys hesitate. Yet beside the rancher's daughter, his fierce demeanor softened, as though she alone could quiet the storm within him. Still, behind every stare from the townsfolk lay unease. Some whispered that she had betrayed her people, that her bond with the Comanche would bring ruin. Others, consumed by jealousy, muttered that no girl of such low standing deserved such devotion from a man of power. The daughter, however, walked with her head high, her steps no longer weighed down by shame. Though fear and doubt surrounded her, she carried herself with a newfound dignity born not from his strength, but from her own resilience finally recognized. The rancher, her father, was torn between relief and dread. Relief, because his daughter was no longer at the mercy of cruel tongues. Dread, because alliances with the Comanche came with consequences the West was not ready to forgive. He feared reprisals from neighboring ranchers, feared the army's suspicion, feared that this bond would bring war to his doorstep. But when he looked into his daughter's eyes, he saw a determination that silenced his protests. She had endured enough humiliation, and now she had found a place where her worth was beyond question. The giant Comanche, though feared, treated her with a tenderness that unsettled many. He taught her words in his language, gestures that carried stories of his people's honor and grief. He spoke of the plains not as wasteland, but as sacred ground, alive with spirits older than the fences that divided the land. Through him, she began to see the West through new eyes, not as a battlefield of survival, but as a living story of resilience and pride. Yet, for all the warmth that bloomed between them, shadows gathered on the horizon. Men who despised the Comanche whispered of revenge, plotting to strike not at the giant himself, but at the woman who had become the bridge between two worlds. And as the days stretched on, it became clear that their union would demand more than courage. It would demand sacrifice. The first sign of trouble came at dusk, when riders from a neighboring ranch appeared at the edge of their land. They did not come to greet, nor to trade. Their words dripped with venom, accusing the daughter of betraying her blood by choosing a man they called a savage. Their threats were not subtle. If she remained with him, they would ensure that neither she nor her family would find peace again. The rancher's daughter stood her ground, but the menace in their eyes promised bloodshed. The giant Comanche did not raise his voice, nor did he draw his weapon. He stood silently, his towering frame casting a shadow long enough to silence the bravest of men. His calm unsettled the intruders more than fury ever could. With a single gesture, he guided his bride back, his presence a shield that told them plainly. If they struck, they would face a storm they could not survive. For now, the men retreated, but their departure carried no peace, only the promise of return. That night, the daughter could not sleep. She watched the flames of the fire dance, thinking of the path her life had taken. She had been scorned for her poverty, her clothes, her dreams, and now she was hated for her choice. Yet, for the first time, she did not feel small. Fear gnawed at her heart, but it could not diminish the strength she felt when the Comanche giant placed his hand gently over hers. In his eyes, she saw not just a husband, but a guardian who believed in her worth. The rancher, however, grew restless. He warned his daughter that the white men would not forgive, that their pride was a weapon more dangerous than any gun. He spoke of soldiers who despised the Comanche, of settlers who longed to drive them into the dust. His voice trembled not with anger, but with the helplessness of a man who saw war creeping closer to his door. But his daughter only shook her head, declaring that she would not live in fear of the same voices that had once mocked her. As dawn approached, the giant Comanche sharpened his weapons, his silence heavier than any oath. He knew the world beyond their fire was preparing to test them. And though his strength was legendary, even he understood that battles fought with steel were easier than battles fought with hate. Still, he vowed silently that no matter what storm rose against them, the rancher's daughter would not face it alone. The tension in town grew heavier with each passing day. At the general store, whispers followed the rancher's daughter like shadows. Women who once turned their backs on her now stared openly, their eyes filled with a venom that burned deeper than words. Men spat in the dirt as she walked by, calling her cursed, a woman who had abandoned her kind for a Comanche giant. Yet, beneath their cruelty lay something more dangerous than hatred: fear. They feared the power her union represented, feared the strength of the warrior who stood beside her, and feared what it meant if boundaries between blood and tribe began to blur. The daughter bore their scorn with dignity, but each word cut like a blade. She remembered the years of ridicule, when her family's poverty had been enough reason for mockery. Now, their cruelty had sharpened into open hostility. Yet for all the pain it brought, she refused to bow. In her heart, she carried the knowledge that she had been chosen not out of pity, but out of respect. And that truth gave her a pride no insult could steal. Her father, the struggling rancher, felt the walls closing in. His land had barely survived drought and debt, and now the anger of his neighbors threatened to destroy what little remained. He begged his daughter to leave the Comanche giant, not out of hatred, but out of desperation to protect what they still had. Tears filled his eyes as he confessed his fear of losing both her and the fragile legacy of their family. Yet, she could not yield, not to fear, not to prejudice, not to men who believed she was worth less than the dust on their boots. Meanwhile, the Comanche giant observed in silence, his dark eyes taking in the hostility that brewed like thunderclouds. He understood hatred well, for his people had endured it for generations. But what startled him was the fire in his bride's spirit, the way she refused to hide, the way she stood taller with every insult hurled her way. He had chosen her because he saw strength, and now the world was witnessing it too. But as the days stretched into nights, one truth became clear. Hatred was gathering force, and soon, whispers and stares would turn into something sharper. The West was a place where tension never stayed hidden for long. and when erupted, it always demanded blood. The breaking point came at a Sunday gathering, when the townsfolk filled the small wooden church with hushed prayers and restless hearts. The daughter entered beside her Comanche husband, and silence fell like a blade. The preacher's voice faltered, the congregation stiffened, and every eye turned toward them, as though their very presence desecrated the room. Then, from the back, a rancher rose, his words dripping with venom. He declared her an outcast, a woman who had betrayed her people, and demanded that she and her husband leave before God himself cast judgment. Gasps filled the room, but no one stood to defend her. The daughter's heart pounded, yet she did not falter. She stepped forward, her voice steady, and reminded them all of the hardships she had endured at their hands long before she ever met the Comanche giant. She spoke of their cruelty, of the laughter that had followed her childhood, of the shame they had forced her to carry. And then she declared that she would no longer live by their scorn. She was no longer the poor rancher's daughter. They had made her an outcast, but he had made her a bride. The giant Comanche placed a protective hand on her shoulder, his silence more powerful than any sermon. The crowd wavered, torn between outrage and the unsettling realization that her words cut too close to the truth. For in condemning her, they had revealed the ugliness of their own hearts. Yet, among the mutters and angry glares, there were a few who lowered their eyes in shame, unwilling to meet the gaze of the woman they had wronged. The preacher, trembling, tried to restore order, but the church was no longer a house of worship. It had become a battlefield of pride and prejudice. Men clenched their fists, women whispered, and children watched wide-eyed as the fragile mask of civility shattered. The daughter, though outnumbered, stood unbroken, her courage filling the silence where fear had once lived. And so they walked out together, into the blazing sun, leaving behind a church divided. Their departure was not defeat, it was defiance. Yet, as the doors closed behind them, the town's anger boiled hotter than ever. The West had never been kind to those who defied its unwritten laws, and the couple's stand had made one thing certain. The storm was coming, and it would not pass quietly. The storm revealed itself sooner than anyone expected. At dusk, flames lit the horizon where the rancher's land stretched wide and vulnerable. By the time they reached the barn, it was too late. The fire roared like a beast, devouring wood, hay, and the last remnants of a herd already weakened by drought. The daughter fell to her knees, her tears mixing with the smoke that burned her eyes. This was no accident. It was a warning, a declaration that the town would not tolerate her union with the Comanche giant. The rancher stood helpless, his weathered hands trembling as he watched his livelihood crumble. Years of toil vanished in a single night, his pride turned to ash by men too cowardly to face him in daylight. Yet, even as despair tightened its grip, his daughter rose from the dirt, her face streaked with soot, but her spirit unbroken. She declared that no fire could destroy the truth of who she was now, nor the bond that had transformed her from the object of scorn into the wife of a warrior. The giant Comanche remained still as stone, his eyes reflecting the blaze. He did not curse, nor did he weep. Instead, he placed his hand upon her shoulder, grounding her in the midst of chaos. For him, fire was not an end, but a beginning, a chance to rebuild stronger than before. He vowed, without words, that they would rise from the ashes together. His people had endured worse, and he would not let hatred dictate the end of their story. But the daughter knew that this act was more than vengeance. It was an invitation to war. Those who had lit the flames would not stop here. They had tested her resolve, and when they saw that she remained unbroken, they would strike again, harder and with no mercy. She looked at her father, his face etched with grief, and swore that she would no longer hide, no longer bend. If the town demanded a reckoning, then she would meet it head-on, not as a girl mocked for her poverty, but as a woman chosen for her strength. As the fire smoldered into embers, the silence of the plains was filled with an unspoken promise. Their enemies believed they had won, but what they had truly done was awaken a force greater than they understood. The rancher's daughter and the Comanche giant now stood at the center of a storm that would test not just their love, but the soul of the entire West. Word of the fire spread quickly, carried on the tongues of both allies and enemies. Some townsfolk whispered sympathy in hushed voices, but none dared to speak it aloud. Fear bound them tighter than the smoke that still lingered over the rancher's land. Others, emboldened by the destruction, gloated in saloons, their laughter spilling over whiskey glasses as they claimed justice had been served. To them, the flames were a lesson, a reminder that anyone who crossed the unwritten lines of the frontier would pay dearly. The rancher, broken by loss, retreated into himself, his eyes hollow as he sat before the blackened remains of his barn. Yet his daughter refused to bow to despair. She walked among the ashes with her head unbent, her presence a silent challenge to those who had hoped to see her crushed. Her resilience ignited something in the hearts of those who had once pitied her. Now they began to see her not as a victim, but as a figure of defiance. The Comanche giant gathered his kin, warriors whose loyalty ran deeper than blood. They rode silently into the night, returning at dawn with supplies, horses, and strong hands ready to rebuild what had been lost. Their presence unsettled the town even further, for the sight of proud warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with the rancher's daughter was more threatening than fire ever could be. It was not just a marriage now. It was an alliance, one that blurred the fragile lines of the frontier. Hatred hardened into fear, and fear twisted into plans whispered in the dark. Men who had once mocked her quietly sharpened their rifles, convincing themselves that they fought for order, for tradition, for the purity of their kind. In truth, they fought against the shame of seeing a woman they had despised rise above them with a strength they could never match. And so, the stage was set. The rancher's daughter, once scorned and mocked, now stood at the center of a tale larger than herself. Her love for the Comanche giant had not only changed her fate, it had challenged the very fabric of the West. And though she knew the battles ahead would demand blood and sacrifice, she no longer trembled. For the first time, she was no longer running from scorn. She was walking straight into destiny. The uneasy quiet that settled after the fire was only a mask for the storm gathering beneath. The town's leaders met in secret, their voices sharp and bitter as they spoke of the rancher's daughter and her Comanche husband. They called her a disgrace, a stain upon their community, and whispered of driving them out once and for all. But deep down, their anger was fueled not only by prejudice, it was by fear. Fear that a poor rancher's daughter, once mocked and dismissed, now carried more strength and loyalty at her side than they could command with all their wealth combined. Meanwhile, life on the ranch began to take shape again. The Comanche warriors worked alongside the daughter, rebuilding fences, digging wells, and restoring what the fire had consumed. Each post driven into the earth was not just a piece of wood, but a declaration that they would not be erased. The sight of it unsettled the townsfolk even more. A once scorned girl now stood surrounded by men who treated her with respect, who listened to her voice, who called her family. Her father, though still shaken, began to see his daughter in a new light. He had spent years believing she was fragile, believing her future depended on the approval of others. But now he watched as she moved with confidence, her words carrying weight, her resolve unshaken. For the first time, he realized she had not been cursed by her union. She had been elevated. And in that realization, a flicker of pride returned to his weary heart. The daughter herself felt the shift inside her. Where once she had been crushed beneath ridicule, now she drew strength from every scar, every cruel word, every loss. They had all forged her into the woman she had become. The Comanche giant did not rescue her. He revealed her. Standing beside him, she was no longer simply his bride. She was a force in her own right, a woman who had endured the desert of scorn and emerged unbreakable. But the horizon darkened again. Scouts from the giant's people brought word of riders gathering in nearby towns, men armed with rifles and hatred. They were not content to burn barns anymore. They wanted to break the bond that threatened their fragile sense of order. And though the daughter and her husband stood strong, they knew that the next strike would not be fire, but blood. The attack came at dawn, as the first light crept over the plains. Hooves thundered in the distance, dust rising like a storm cloud. The daughter stood at the edge of the ranch, her heart pounding, her eyes locked on the riders closing in. She had dreamed of this moment, feared it, but now that it was here, she felt no trembling in her hands. Instead, She felt a fire that had been smoldering for years, an unyielding defiance born from every insult, every cruel laugh, every scar of poverty she had carried. The Comanche giant and his warriors mounted quickly, their chants echoing across the land. It was a sound that carried both fear and awe, a reminder that they were not shadows in the desert, but men of flesh and fire who would not be erased. The daughter's father, old and weary, clutched his rifle with hands that had not held steady in years. Yet, in his eyes, there was no fear now, only the determination to stand with his child, no matter the cost. The riders charged, their faces twisted with rage, their rifles gleaming in the rising sun. But as they neared the ranch, they were met not with weakness, but with a wall of resolve. Arrows flew, rifles cracked, and the air filled with the thunder of battle. The daughter remained at the center of it all, her voice calling to both sides, pleading not for peace, but for justice. She shouted that she would never again be bent by the weight of scorn, that they could not burn her spirit as they had her land. The clash was brutal, the kind of fight that etched itself into memory. Dust and blood mingled in the air, cries of fury and pain rising above the chaos. Yet, through it all, the rancher's daughter stood unbroken, her presence commanding more than any weapon. She was no longer the poor girl mocked at church or the outcast whispered about in town. She was a bride, a warrior in her own right, a woman who carried both the strength of her people and the spirit of the Comanche at her side. And as the sun climbed higher, the battle raged with no clear victor. But one truth became undeniable. The West would never be the same again. The scorned daughter had become the spark of a fire greater than hatred, and the story unfolding in blood and dust would echo long after the gunfire ceased. The sun rose higher, casting its merciless light over the battleground. Smoke drifted from rifles, arrows split the air, and cries of rage and agony shook the silence of the plains. The riders who had come to destroy were stunned by the ferocity of the resistance. They had expected fear, retreat, surrender. Instead, they faced a wall of courage, a handful of Comanche warriors, a weary rancher with his rifle, and at the center of it all, the daughter they had once mocked, standing as though the land itself had chosen her. The Comanche giant fought like a storm unleashed, each strike of his weapon echoing with the power of generations wronged. He did not fight for conquest. He fought for her. Every movement of his towering frame was a shield against the hatred that had hunted her for years. Yet even his strength was tested as the riders pressed harder, determined to break what they could not understand. Still, he would not yield. The daughter's voice rose above the chaos, commanding attention even as bullets tore through the dust. She cried out not in fear, but in defiance, declaring to those who sought her death that she had already survived worse, that their scorn had tried to kill her long before their weapons ever could. Her words cut deeper than steel, shaking the confidence of men who had never seen such fire from the woman they had once ridiculed. Her father, though weakened by age and grief, fought with a strength that surprised even himself. Each shot from his rifle carried the weight of a promise that he would not let his daughter stand alone again. For years, he had watched her suffer under the town's cruelty, powerless to shield her from it. But now, in this final stand, he fought with every ounce of life left in him, as if to make up for all the times he had been silent. And then, as the battle raged, a turning point came. One of the riders, wounded and shaken, dropped his weapon and fled into the desert. Another followed, their courage dissolving beneath the weight of resistance they had never anticipated. The tide began to shift, and with it, the balance of fate itself. By midday, the dust began to settle, leaving behind a field marked by silence and scars. The riders who had come with fury were broken, their numbers shattered, their will undone. Those who survived fled with shame burning in their hearts, carrying with them the truth they had tried to deny, that a poor rancher's daughter, once scorned, had risen higher than any insult could reach. The Comanche giant, though bloodied, stood tall, his chest rising with the breath of victory. His bride rushed to his side, her hands trembling as they touched his wounds, but her eyes shone with pride. For she knew this battle had not been fought only with weapons, but with spirit, with the unyielding belief that love and dignity could stand against hatred and prevail. Her father, weary and leaning on his rifle, looked upon his daughter with tears in his eyes. He saw not the girl mocked in church pews, not the child burdened by poverty, but a woman transformed into a legend before his very eyes. In her strength, he found peace. In her defiance, he found redemption for the years he had doubted her worth. The town, watching from a distance, could no longer deny what had unfolded. Their whispers would never again carry the same cruelty, for the daughter they had ridiculed had become untouchable. She had fought not only for herself, but for every soul who had ever been crushed beneath the weight of scorn. The story of her defiance and the loyalty of the Comanche giant would be told and retold, spreading across the West like wildfire. And so, the rancher's daughter walked forward into a new life, not as a victim, not as a symbol of shame, but as a bride whose name would be remembered in legend. For in the heart of the Old West, where pride often killed and hatred often ruled, she had proven a truth that no fire, no bullet, and no scorn could erase. That dignity, once claimed, could never again be stolen. The battle was over, but its echo would live on in the dust of the frontier. The rancher's daughter, once mocked for her poverty and dismissed as unworthy, had risen to a place where no insult could ever touch her again. She had endured the cruelty of a town blinded by pride and hatred, yet she emerged not broken, but transformed. Her strength was not borrowed from the Comanche giant, but revealed by the love and respect he offered. Together, they had turned scorn into legend, and their story into a beacon for all who doubted their own worth. What began as ridicule ended as revelation. The daughter's scars became her armor, her suffering became her strength, and her silence became a voice that could not be ignored. She stood as proof that destiny does not belong to those who laugh from the shadows, but to those who rise in defiance of them. And in the arms of the warrior who called her his bride, she found not escape, but recognition of the dignity she had carried all along. Her father, once bound by fear, finally saw that the true wealth of a man was not in cattle, nor land, nor coin, but in the courage of those who bore his name. He watched his daughter take her place in history with pride that no drought or debt could erase. For in her victory, he found redemption for every moment he had doubted her light. And the town, though silent now, would never again look at her the same way. She had become untouchable. This story is more than a tale of love and conflict. It is a mirror. It asks us to look at the scars we carry and ask, are they marks of defeat or of the proof of battle survived? The rancher's daughter shows us that it is not the weight of scorn that defines us, but the strength we find in rising above it. In the harshest of lands, in the cruelest of times, she chose not to bow, and in that choice, she became eternal. If this story touched you, share in the comments what part struck your heart the most. Let your voice join the echo of her defiance. And if you want to keep walking through powerful stories of the Old West, tales of love, struggle, and redemption, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every gesture helps keep alive the spirit of these unforgettable journeys, reminding us all that even in the wildest deserts, dignity and hope can still bloom.